I think we're live. Let's check. Yes.
Okay.
Welcome everyone who's here today. And this is the seventh episode now in quick succession. Thank you for joining. We started as a non-series and it quickly became a series. So now, yeah, it seems to be working pretty well. And our guest today is Federico Malagutti. So you probably know him from a bunch of really interesting HEMA
Hello.
videos. And I'll let him introduce himself because he probably does a better job than I can.
I am Federico Malagutti, and I run a YouTube channel which is like about HEMA, actually, and it's focused on the subject by various perspectives. So let's say techniques, but also like psychology, how to deal with tournaments, uh, a certain kind of philosophy, let's say, of HEMA. So I try to go into it in a deeper way sometimes. But I generally share, of course, more technical stuff, exercises, sparring videos, and everything which rotates around the subject, let's say.
Cool. So how long have you been in HEMA for, and how did you start also, I think?
Oof, that's a huge question. So I am practicing like sword fighting stuff since 14 years, basically, a little bit more. And I practice HEMA properly, let's say, since 12, basically, 11, 12 years. And at first I joined as most of the people who start practicing HEMA club, which was about reenactment,
Hmm.
but it was like a relatively poor level of reenactment back then. And we were more obsessed about sword fighting, actually. And then I casually, actually, thanks to one of the first videos uploaded on YouTube, I discovered the HEMA, and I was like, oh, but it is possible to do this kind of thing with masks, etc. And so improve our practice, and then from there everything started basically. So that was
Cool.
the start. The thing then developed through the years, and like for me, it became as we were discussing before the live, it became basically a job. I will say 5 years ago, I
Hmm.
approached it as a job, and of course it was a jump in the void, let's say, because it's a weird job, of course, and but it worked. So here I am now. I like travel around, do seminars, teach private private students, classes, etc.
That's really cool. And you have been probably, let's say, it seems like, well, 15 years, that would be one of the first generations after the real pioneers, like when you, I don't know, like Matt Easton and stuff, those are the first guys working like 25 years ago or something like that. But you would
Yeah.
probably be one of the first.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. Well, I will say you're right. I suspect we can consider it like I am basically part of the second generation of HEMA fencers slash instructors, and here we are now in a I would say like the third generation started since quite some time already. So it's a different time period. When I started, we were still in that moment in which pioneers already started to create equipment which was dedicated for the practice, but it was still at the very beginning. So everyone was using a mixture of the things which were like improvised for the thing and things which were actually made for the practice itself. So it was a weird time, let's say.
and did you see a lot of difference, let's say, between what was being circulated in terms of information and material? Obviously, I assume a lot of it was in English versus the landscape, let's say in Italy, for example, of HEMA. Is there something you noticed?
Like, well, for us in Italy, it's relatively easy because you know there are a lot of manuals which are
Mm.
accessible just by talking Italian, even if like some manuals are not so easy to read. But the majority of things which were accessible and still are generally speaking, we're talking about other traditions were in English. And I, funny enough, started, and that's funny to an extent, I will say, with an English translation of a German longsword fencing master, which is Scheinen Ringek, and it was my first, basically my first manual, and the first practice which I approached. Then I switched to 133, so another manual which is not in Italian, and then finally I approached the Fiore, and I found the enlightenment.
Okay, so actually, I think this is interesting because you, transitioned from, let's say, German school to Fiore specifically for the Italian, right?
Yep.
What are the biggest obstacles or differences you had to kind of face in this transition, if any?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question, because my transition in between traditions, let's call them, has also happened with a transition in between approaches to actual practice and actual fencing. So when I started, of course, besides the first 2 years in which I was just doing sword stuff, then I approached the German longsword, but it was for a brief time, in a sense that I approached it for a year and a half, basically. And my understanding of the source was terrible. So I was just reading the stuff, and as most people do when they approach the manual for the first time, I was basically trying to do everything sticking to the manual in an obsessive way, by the perspective of what was wrote on the manual, which, fun enough, wasn't necessarily what was actually on the manual, because it was already a translation. Then mine was a translation of a translation. So I was practicing something which, to an extent, of course, it wasn't, now that I can see it from farther away, it was not so far away from what was wrote on the manual, but there was differences, because I was trying to stick into every teaching, while, think about, it's an approach like reading a book, which tells you a story, and then you think that all the parts of the story are needed to understand every other part of the story which is after it. And that's not the approach of fighting, generally speaking, and not the approach to learn fighting. Some things are useful sometimes, other times are not, other times are wrong. And,
and also incomplete, right? I was talking, I think it was with Dequitem last time, about the also promotional content in a lot of these treatises. So it's like, oh, everyone is doing this, so I need to show something unusual and weird, but that may not necessarily be at the core of the technique. Or
well, like on that, I will say that I partially agree with it, because there are some masters which are showing off, let's say, and they are trying to sell stuff. But the ones which are doing it especially are not, they are slightly easy to spot. And there are some which are not even, which can't even considered, to an extent, masters by the perspective of us, in a sense of 21st century people who study the stuff. Like Tal Offer, for instance, it was just like was a sword master for sure. He was, but he was the manual is just I don't know. It's a book which tries to sell stuff, and that's the idea behind the book. So you can't read it in the same way in which you read like Fiore, for instance, which is different. But Fiore is also different from the Lichtenauer tradition masters, and the difference is super deep, because it happens at various levels, even society. Like Fiore was like a man at arms to an extent,
Yeah.
let's call him. And instead, who wrote the Lichtenauer tradition manuals was not always, but on average, of course, a knight, sometimes, well, actually, every single time almost, but also a person which studied at higher level in, what's the name in English, universities.
Hmm.
So all the manuals are different from various motivations, and they come from very, very different society and from different environments. And so they develop in different ways. For sure, some people were trying to sell stuff plainly. And
Okay, so considering they've been dead for a few hundred years, I think it's safe to name and shame. So, who do you think are the most marketing-driven masters versus the ones that you would say, oh, okay, these guys are really the real deal?
okay, so well, I already named. I will say I'm talking about Middle Ages
Hmm.
basically, and Renaissance to an extent because it's the stuff which I know more. And I will say that of the medieval slash Renaissance masters, medieval mainly, of course, Taloffer is the guy which is selling stuff. Period. He's
Hmm.
just selling stuff. It's there is nothing to say more than that. While others were, of course, interested in selling their craft, but they approached it in a way which was serious, basically I would say every single time.
Hmm.
One example, for instance, like Mao Tzu tells you the prices. Like you should teach this assalto for that amount of money. So it's a manual for people of basically a school which
Hmm.
should teach that assalti, and they should know how much they have to ask for that assalto. So there is always the idea behind it of selling stuff, but this is also related to how the society was structured, and it was also related to their social conditions
Hmm.
inside of that society. But for instance, like even of course Fiore was trying to sell his book and his craft. So I will say everyone was doing it, but in different ways, and it depends from time period and what they were trying to sell. For
Hmm.
instance, Maozzo received some money even by the city to teach, well, Maozzo. I can't remember if he received money. I am almost sure that he received a meal that was granting him some money so that he
Okay,
can
yeah,
forge the teaching for basically to teach people
yeah,
how to fight because it was useful for the city. And the
yeah.
same was for Dardi, it seems, which was the originary master of the Bolognese tradition, which we don't know a lot of, but we know that
Yes,
he was
so
receiving some money.
yeah, and we have some comments that while you talk are confirming exactly what you're saying. So here, Nicolo from the Spadone project is talking exactly now about, well, the whole
Ah,
thread starts with the whole thread. Let me see if I can improve my management of comments, but he starts with, so now you read Marozzo.
I don't know how to read Marozzo actually. There are a lot of words and they don't make a lot of sense to me, but it's not
Yeah,
my
and then
fault.
there's, yeah. And then there's, yeah, the mail. And do you know if it was a steel mill or like a flour mill? I guess it would make way more sense if it
I
was.
don't know actually. I don't
Okay.
know, but I always call him the mill guy so that people get upset.
Cool. And in the meantime, I'll also just quickly go through a few comments because I already have a lot. So a lot of people giving compliments, saying hi. So thank you to everyone for joining. I'm just running through them quickly. Um, and we already have comment here, yeah, by Julian Ronneberger. We talked a couple of episodes ago, but yeah, he's talking about going back to the point you were making about manuals and treatises. How, yeah, we even have a notebook that was made for himself, so we know that that must have been non-marketing material, let's say, but pure practice. I had a question about the when you're mentioning the social organization, let's say through the Middle Ages, and when you mentioned Marozzo kind of talking about prices and giving like a list, it almost feels like he's kind of setting up a bit of a guild process in a sense, like giving, uh, yeah, fixed prices or suggestions, let's say.
Like, I
But at
suspect,
the okay.
go for it, sorry.
No, I was just thinking at the same time you mentioned a lot of these were knights or came from, let's say, a high social, at least maybe not economical, but social position. So do we have information on like the social distribution of these masters? Were a lot of them, were the majority of them nobles, or did you have also up and coming bourgeoisie?
It depends from the period. I can mainly talk about Middle Ages, and one important thing that we have to consider is that the 15th century, in which we basically have the greatest majority of the masters that we consider medieval, knighthood was something that you could buy, basically. And one motivation why I also like Fiore so much is that he was indeed already inside of that period of time, because everything started in the 14th century. Well, even before it, but let's say that during the 14th century, people were starting to buy knighthood never before, etc. And but it's still related to the old ways, let's say. So that's why I like it. But that said, so to not go away from the original question, yes, there were a lot of knights, but knight meant everything basically, and people could buy the knighthood, and that means that it was not related to some kind of enlightened social condition, or like even oh, my father was a knight and now I am a knight, or whatever. So it's lesser cool to an extent that we may expect, but I actually find it cooler because of this motivation, because it's not necessarily that someone has to be a knight because of some magical weird condition. People which were good at the craft eventually became good masters. It's not that everyone could become a knight, of course. It's not that the peasant could just, okay, we'll spare the money to become a knight. Unluckily, it wasn't the thing, but some people could, to an extent, of course, go a little bit higher in their economical condition and eventually buy knighthood, which means that there were terrible knights that we would not even consider knights, but also people which that were knights, but theoretically speaking could not be in the old ways of doing things, and they became, and they actually performed well. I suspect that Fiore, it's funny. I'm going to say something which it's weird, but I know a guy which is making a research, and I can say a lot of it because it will be published eventually in the future. I know a guy which made a very interesting research on the subject of Fiore. It's a French guy, actually, and he discovered a number of things. One thing which I know for sure is that most probably Fiore basically ramped up on the social status in that time period. So he's part of those people there. It was not like the super cool guy. Okay, I'm born super cool and I am super cool like Rich. No, he was not probably that.
Yeah, he would have been, as far as I know, from like a minor nobility, right? A bit of a lower level.
Minor nobility, and we don't even know if it was already stabilized minor nobility, like son of a minor noble, or if he actually became a minor noble, because like
Okay.
so that's but I would even find it cooler if it was the guy which made his own self. I will buy the knighthood and will become the better knight ever ever made.
That would make for a good movie. That's for sure. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you on the research you were mentioning, though.
Oh, no. Well, that's basically the only thing I can say because I swear it to
Okay.
the guy which I met in French the past year that I will not say too much, but about the subject. But let's say that don't worry. In the future, every one of us, at some point, I don't know when, we will know more about Fiore, and
Nice.
that's
That's
for sure.
okay, cool. So we've focused a lot on late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. So that's obviously your cup of tea in terms of practice and study. Um, Maybe the question is why that specific period? Like what made you so interested in that?
So why? Well, I'm going to say something which people will hate. I love Middle Ages because I always loved fantasy stuff.
Mhm.
It's so sad, right?
Well, I think it's more common than people are willing to admit. So,
So at some point, I thought to myself, like, Fede, you have to say it because you are going around to all these people which are all about history and stuff. I am too now, to a far greater extent than since I was like 14. But the reality is that I was a huge nerd. I was playing World of Warcraft all the time and stuff like that, and I just wanted to be the guy of World of Warcraft. Like, I want to be a knight.
yeah. I feel like the real revenge of the nerds is happening in these years when it's becoming cool to actually be interested in stuff that other 10, 20 years ago would have got you excluded from parties.
But
So,
actually, about the subject. Sorry if I interrupt you. You wanted
no,
to?
no, that was
Okay.
it.
So one thing which I think is that I also wrote something about it, not so much, not so a lot of time ago. Uh, that HEMA basically is the first, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first practices which made nerds eager to train.
Mm.
And I suspect it's, if someone would ask me what is the greatest success of HEMA, my answer, pragmatically speaking, of course, there are other answers, but pragmatically speaking, for today, that's the, the best success. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's objectively true, I think. I assume there are other activities as well, but what's cooler than training with a sword? So,
definitely, I agree.
yeah, and the comments seem to confirm that because we have here Prosper Tipaldi saying about 50% of my HEMA club talking about nerds, and then again the D&D into playing with swords pipeline, which so far has been confirmed with most people I've talked to, for sure.
I,
So, yeah, yes.
I don't know. I was saying I'm not back from a session of not D&D, but Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But
Which
it just
is
came
maybe
back.
even more nerdy than than Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so when it comes to HEMA, you obviously, one of the things that comes out a lot in your videos is you seem not to just be a practitioner in the sense of kind of putting in practice things people say, but you've kind of elaborated your own approach to HEMA and your own thought. So how would you maybe distill that into a few points that are you feel are kind of uniquely yours or developed by you?
Okay, so I will say that the uniqueness, let's call it, of my approach is made of let's say parts which are not unique at all, and simply trying to put together aspects which sometimes get extremized or people get specialized into specific subjects. While I don't know, maybe because I even approached Fiore, and I also follow without even wanting the a more holistic approach, etc. I really enjoy the idea of having all the aspects of HEMA all together, in a sense of having a practice which is interesting, peculiar, and particular also because it is related to the physique and the mind together. And I really try to push actually this kind of thing. I try to make big efforts on the channel also to make people enjoy both the aspects. Of course, you can't force people to do what they don't like, but I try to make people aware of the fact that it is not something which is only cool. It is also useful because you can learn by reading theory, you can learn by practicing, you can learn by even teaching, actually. And everything, the sources, the various practice that you can make, like by doing cross training or whatever, are all useful to put things together into perspective, and it is easier to reason and think in a way which is functional to whatever you're going to do, be it fencing, teaching, whatever. And it's, of course, a way which requires a little bit more time because, of course, if someone has only a strict amount of time, not a lot of time to dedicate to the practice, you have to choose. And I understand very well, of course. But ideally, my advice for everyone is that the best way is the way in which you approach all the parts of the practice and you put them together. And I think that, and that's my opinion, it's not proven by anything, but I think that it is also the best way to develop a fencing which is effective and cool at the same time. Because, you know, on one side of, this is true for the greatest majority of things we do in life, fun enough, but on one side we have the pragmatic aspects of the thing, and on the other side we have the romantic part of the things. And generally speaking, the best is happens in the middle, because if you do something that works, you enjoy it, and you are happy because it works, and you can improve over something that you know it makes sense. But at the same time, if you lose that romantic part, something breaks, and the magic goes away. You are just a machine that is doing something without any motivation. That's why I push for that kind of thing. Let's not lose the magic of what we do.
Yeah, which reminds me kind of a lot of the kind of holistic view in a lot of Eastern martial arts, and which kind of tends to, yes, I mean, you're working your body, yes, you're practicing to fight in potential real scenarios, but there's also like you're working on the mind, working on the soul in a sense to build. And you also have experience, by the way, with a bunch of martial arts which are outside of HEMA. So how do you feel that those things relate?
Well, it's not like my perspective, of course, it's the product of a huge amount of practices and experiences that I made, which actually made me what I am now. But I will say that partially, yes, something comes from that, but not maybe in the way which is expected. Fun enough, when I practiced traditional martial arts, I practiced the traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu for a little bit more than 4 years, and the Jodo, which is the short stick, basically, against katana. It's a very peculiar kind of style. And I also practiced a little bit of Aikido 1 year. All these practices were I approached them in a moment in which I was also practicing mainly with minimal gear in HEMA. So it's it's an important part of what made my experience actually of what I have right now, what I am right now. But at some point, I basically refused this kind of thing. So I got like, okay, that's enough, and it is too extreme. This stuff doesn't work. Like, there are too much limits. There are too much. I am too constrained into what I can do. And so I basically jumped on the other side of the spectrum. I was like, okay, so I have to do completely different things. Like the sport is the way to go because it's real, because you can punch people and you can hit people with the sword, blah, blah. And in the end, after 3-4 years of doing that stuff, I said, well, even that part here has a lot of limits because of the opposite motivations. Yeah. And the solution is pretty easy. It's like, okay, so if you don't stay on one extreme and you don't stay on the other, chances that stay in the middle may be a very good idea. And I am really enjoying it. I am performing better in sports now that I approach stuff in this way, because I find more meaning in the process, and I can perform also well in the practical part.
That's really cool. And you, by the way, in case anyone is in the area, in Federico's area, he has his HEMA school, so which you started yourself. And do you try to teach this approach to your students? And do you see a difference compared to other ways HEMA is taught in your approach?
So I will say that there are a few. Let's start by saying HEMA is so complex, and so there is so much variety in terms of approaches that I would not call my way of approaching things particularly peculiar, because of course I also experienced a lot of other way of teaching, and the majority of them which I met was different from one another. So there is a huge variety in approaches. It's not there is not so much uniformity in the environment in this moment. But I will say that the way in which I approach it is peculiar, let's say, in a sense that follows precisely what I just told you, but by a practical perspective. So I try to pick the things which ideally I will evolve it also in the future as much as I can, stick together without interfering with each other. For instance, like in terms of techniques, I use names, practices, actually the way in which they are applied, and forms, guards, etc., which are on the manual. And in terms of tactics, I use the tactical language which is used in modern times after hundreds of years of evolutions in this approach, because tactics is something that evolved with time, but it is not strictly connected with the form, because technique and tactics are two different environments which coexist and works together, but they are separate. So you can pick techniques from one side and tactics from the other, and you can make them fit together in a way which is very, very
nice.
So that's my way of doing things in a couple of words, let's say.
Cool. So we'll quickly catch up on a few comments just because they've been piling up. So hi and bye to Ahab, which had to leave. And I think the final phrase there is a compliment both to you and to me, so thank you.
Thank you.
Then we have Sword and Science was asking, and Sword Science and Historical Fencing is asking you where everyone is and whether you forgot to announce it on Patreon.
On Patreon, I published it on Facebook and on YouTube, but I forgot to make it on. Sorry. I am a terrible YouTuber, and everyone. So.
Well, some of the next comments are actually addressing that. So we have here don't know where you live, guessing the Alps, but you have win the best HEMA video background award. So you're not too bad of a YouTuber. And Sword Science and Historical Fencing agrees. Oh, actually, we have a question that sorry, I forgot to. It slipped away here, but yes, here. Sword science and historical fencing was asking. No, not this one. Where is it? Oh man, my comment management is not great. Here, Prosperity Paddy again. So, did you have an interest in history before, or did it come with HEMA practice?
Well, I had it before too, of course. Like I was real in a sense of the fantasy aspect because I wanted to be honest,
Hmm.
and but my love for fantasy stuff was coexisting, and to an extent was also increased by my love for history. So it is not that okay. So I like medieval-based stuff, and I don't know medieval. I don't like medieval stuff. I like
Hmm.
medieval stuff, but especially when I was young, which is what brought this, let's say, passion. I was, as for the greatest majority of people, I will say, my distinguishing between one environment and the other was not that easy. You know, the guy which watches, I don't know, the Lord of the Rings and thinks that the weapons are historically accurate or stuff like that.
Yes.
That's the 15 years old guy, which sometimes never ages and remains a
Yeah.
15 years. But,
And I think it's one of those crucial things to keep interest in or passion in history is if I think back to the way I studied, there was a lot of debunking myths, which sometimes, by the way, was incorrect, the debunking itself. Like the myths are actually true. But there was this very downplaying of everything. Oh, anything that is a little bit romantic, as you mentioned, was very downplayed. And I think that causes huge damage to interest in history because then you have those visions of history where everything is dark, gray, there's no vibrancy, nothing interesting. Everyone's just hanging out in the mud. It's like, okay, this I don't want to. This isn't something I'm interested in. But reality actually was way more beautiful.
yeah, you touched on a subject which I really enjoy actually, and I suspect that one of the motivations why people in a society, and I suspect we are still doing it to a great extent, besides very interested people, is that we want to downplay other parts of history because we really want and hope that we are living in the best moment of our history. I
Yes.
don't say it's we are right, and I don't say we are wrong because I can't
Mm.
know. But we want so much the these kind of thing that we are ready to say, okay, so everything before yesterday it was mud shit stuff. Everything was gray and brown.
Yeah.
I suspect it wasn't necessarily the case. I suspect that for a lot of people the life was harder. But yeah, that's what you say. Yeah, I really like to approach things by both a pragmatic and a romantic perspective. It's not that one destroys the other.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, we do have various examples of history not kind of progressing in a linear way, so there's no reason to think that things aren't more complex than we see them. Um, so before we get back into the history aspect, we have one comment here that I want to highlight. So left-handed HEMA, Ursula Ramirez, obviously enjoyed your commentary on left-handers. Um, and as a left-hander myself, I'm actually curious about what. So, as far as I've been able to understand, there seems to be generally a slight advantage to left-handers initially because of the habit a lot of people have of facing right-handed uh,
Okay,
fencers. But I don't know if that. Like, I'm curious to hear your insights.
so let's say uh, let's deal with this in the proper way. So first of all, you left-handers are devils. No, no. Jokes aside, yes, in a sense that like left-hand people may be at great disadvantage or at great advantage depending from the fact if their instructors or themselves, is if they are particularly like fast in growing by themselves, they think about things a lot, etc. They can be at great disadvantage or great advantage depending from the fact if they actually understand and that they are left-handed. And you will say, but Federico, I know that I am a left-handed, which is true. Everyone knows if they are using one hand or the other, but getting into the idea that you have to do the things basically in the same way by, let's say, a tactical perspective, but you have to adjust a little by a technical perspective to deal with the fact that, generally speaking, you're not perfectly, you're specular and not in the standard condition with your opponent. This comes with either experience, or if you have an instructor which tells you, look, you have to be ready to do this and that slightly in these conditions and that conditions. Technically speaking, you do the same things as I do, and you have to learn them in the same way, but the moment in which you're going to apply them is slightly different. This is what at some point divides leftists, and either they remain unaware of this simple concept, but which is not simple at all to get, actually. And if they move away from that condition, they become increasingly advantaged because they simply are dealing with the same problem over and over and over, while the right-hander fences with a lefty like only 5% of the time, maybe less sometimes. And so they aren't able to grow the experience at the same speed. It's funny when you find leftists fighting leftists. And one thing which I noticed is that, which is also a thing which a student of mine, which is lefty, when he fenced another lefty for the first time, said, oh, things are working in a better way. Because actually, yes, it's not that because you are so used to fence right-handers, when you fence another lefty, everything goes bad. No, you simply grow so much and you are so experienced that finally, when you find the situation which is the correct one, let's say the ideal one, everything works fine. So yeah, like lefty people are slightly advantaged compared to right-handers, and that's why on average, when you reach high levels of weapon-based fighting, you find a lot of lefties. And
interesting.
It makes sense. So you're gifted.
Yeah, that's very good to know. And in terms of historical accounts, so we obviously know that there existed left-handed fighters historically, even though it may have been not encouraged. We even have left-handed swords, for swords at least, that are asymmetrical, so they definitely were not uncommon. Do we have accounts of masters or fighters that were left-handed?
That's a question. Like if I think about it, about masters, I can't remember any. But one of my instructor's friend is just going through the various manuals of Fiore and basically putting like all the various images and the gloss of the same, together of the various manuals, etc. And he discovered the glossa, which I remember I read because I watched the image, but I didn't remember that he mentioned it. That basically, maybe it's on the horse part, and Theo says that, and this action works like, he says something like, this action works both on the right and on the left, and also for like right-handers and left-handers.
Okay. So
like against right-handers and left-handers. And it was like very peculiar because I wasn't really aware, honestly, of a manual which was also mentioning like, yeah, you're going to face left-handers at some point. So it seems it's clear that it was something that was taken in consideration, and that happened for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to mention it means that it's not a super rare occasion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, so we also have a question here. It's already been partially answered in the comments, but I wanted to hear your opinion by Maike on women and girls in HEMA. So the answer has been yes, it's a very inclusive sport, but I was curious about whether you've seen increasing trend in the years. What are the factors that have maybe led more women into it? Or just feel free to give your opinion.
Well, I would say that well, the trend maybe is slightly increased, but I would say that on average, the percentage of women that are enjoying the practice compared to men is lower.
Mm.
I'm not sure. I suspect that even if we do whatever we can to say, oh my God, please come and do stuff, we will see more or less on average. I don't know. We will never see 50-50, I suspect. Maybe yes, but I
Mm.
suspect not. I hope for yes, but I suspect not. But anyway, the environment of women is increasing, and there are also people like women instructors which are doing a great job on social media, etc., to promote the stuff.
Mhm.
The average level of fencing among women is increasing. I would say, funny enough, I would say at a higher speed than the male level, because they had to compensate a gap, and now
Yeah.
they basically ran faster and faster. I would say on the international environment, it's easy to see. And yeah, so like HEMA is of course for women too, and I would say join it if you enjoy it.
I can wholeheartedly support that that thought. So going back to this was supposed to be my third question, but we got a little bit.
Because I talk a
um,
lot.
yeah. So
Sorry.
so you have experience with antiques as well. So you were part of the group that was in Zurich a few weeks ago measuring antiques together with Nicolo and Julian. Um, so how does what is your role in this kind of research? Why did you approach, what's your interest in antiques, let's say, and how does it relate to your practice?
Okay, so like when I was in Zurich, Julian watched me and said, "Are you even interested in swords at all?" Because I was there to watch just a couple of swords. I was really into it, and that's generally how I approach things. So
Hmm.
it is not that I am super duper nerd about antique swords, but I really enjoy them in relation to my craft, let's say.
Hmm.
So I am really into like if I see a bunch of antique swords, I am of course excited, but I'm not overly excited. Like it's like, oh, cool stuff. Like, but
Hmm.
if I see something which is like, which may be precisely the sword that it's relevant for my time period, the context I'm studying, etc. There, that's when my eyes go like blink, and that's how I deal with this stuff. So, if possible, like I went with Niccolo Menozzi to give a look to some Spadoni, etc., and I really enjoyed that experience. I mainly did it because, first of all, I enjoy history and I enjoy swords, and because he's a friend of mine. But of course, if I have to do it for myself, that's uh, that's why that's the moment in which I go for the sword which I really want to see, because it's the one I would like ideally use in a duel, which would ideally use in self defense and stuff like that.
Hmm. Was
Oh,
this your,
second, sorry.
sorry, yes. So in the meantime, I'll just mention if anyone wants to or hasn't yet subscribed to the channel, this is your chance. And also check out, of course, Federico's channel and Patreon. And yeah, this is the moment where we promote things.
Thank you.
But but yeah, so my question was this your first experience with such antique swords, or?
Well, giving a look to, well, no, I already had the occasion to, let's say, manipulate 15th century swords.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect it was the first time I managed to put my hands on a 14th century sword instead. But we had to be very careful, of course, because it was in relatively bad conditions.
Okay,
And
yeah.
but yeah, in that sense, yes, it was my first time I like not handled, but I touched and measured a 14th century sword. So it was really cool. Also, it had an inscription. I suspect it was even a 13th century sword. I'm not sure. Even
That's early.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have Fede mentioning, Julian mentioning, asking you to tell us about the original Vechtschwert.
Oh, yeah. So basically, we had, and we also have to shoot a video on the subject, funny enough. But my micro broke, and we have to still do it. Now I fixed it, as you can see. Luckily for you, because you risked it too. But what basically Julian did is that they measured the original Vechtschwert, which are stored in there in Zurich, and they basically made copies of almost one-to-one, in a sense they are basically the same sword. And me and Julian fenced with them in not in Zurich, but in Canton Ticino, in which I taught the seminar. Mm-hmm. And they are interesting tools for sure. They are, I suspect, like they are less flexible than people may expect. For instance, they handle different from the Federschwert that we use in HEMA, and of course they look different too. They are also weird because they stick a little bit more when they cross, you know. Compared to, and so they give a completely they give a relatively different sensation when you are fencing, which is interesting to try out for sure.
Okay, we'll dive into that in just a moment, but Julian is actually specifying that no, he meant the one that you handled an original.
Oh yeah, and I handled them too, of course.
Yes. So, wait, we also have some comments from Niccolo about I think the fact of multiple different interests going to measure swords and participating in looking at the antiques. And a cool thing is having different people specializing in specific topics and cooperating to share the knowledge. That way everyone can master a specific thing at his or her best, which I think is... yeah, it's a super cool thing I'm learning about kind of the sword community or people interested in swords, is that they come from all kinds of different backgrounds, but they're always really open to share and communicate, which does not happen everywhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, like specialization is good, especially in terms of research, I suspect, and it may happen at various levels. I am like a huge fan of research specialization, and I am a huge fan of holistic approach in terms of practicing. So depending on the context, you see me on one side or the other.
Yeah, always in that middle area you were talking about. Yeah,
balance the thing up.
Yes. So in terms of practice, you mentioned, and already when we talked to Julian and Cyril, we had a lot of, well, it actually came out in a lot of the conversations I had, this difference between, let's say, authentically built practice swords or swords in general and the ones we use for HEMA. So as, let's say, a teacher, but also a high-level practitioner, do you feel that HEMA would benefit from moving towards a more authentically historical weapon, or do you feel that it's good enough the way we are, the kind of the whole production pipeline and things is the
Well,
best it can be?
that's a good question, and I honestly don't have a precise answer for you, because we have to think about the fact that, like, that's my opinion for sure. Um, the weapons were that people use, like, we want to have weapons which look, aesthetically speaking, more as old weapons, but that's not what a practice weapon was also back then. So theoretically speaking, we showed the research, as Julian did also, historical practice weapons, but are not so common, actually are pretty rare, I would say. And we have only a selection of them. So it's not even easy to say how like fencing weapon, let's call it, was in the 14th century, and was even a fencing weapon back then, etc., etc. Then we may find sources that say yes, no, etc., etc., but maybe we don't know the shape, blah blah blah. So the answer is complex in this regards. I will say that whenever it's possible, we should do the best in terms of recreating something historical, especially when we are researching. And if a fencer, especially, and an instructor, is using his time and effort to recreate something that is, let's say, as historically accurate as possible, because I put the quotes because there are so much levels of historically accurate. Like, historically accurate talking, we should be dressed in the proper way, we should be without protections, and we should kill each other. That's that's the real historically accurate thing. So when instead of talking about practice, it is fine enough, even more complex to recreate, because we almost know anything like about like killing and hurting each other. We know a lot of stuff, fun enough, because it was more considered and talked about. But about practice, we know it's mostly about speculation. So my idea is that we have to do the best possible in these regards, as much as possible. But how much and how relevant this is, it's hard to say. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
and I think this even connects a lot to the purpose of the manuals and the treatises, for example. So we know a lot of them are fencing manuals in the sense that they're meant for a use that is, well, some of them are almost sports-like, especially a lot of the research Julian is doing. And then we have fencing that's more meant for duels or like combat in a situation that is one-on-one. But then, of course, if you think of Fiore, he is writing also, let's say, a kind of one-on-one combat in a sense there, but he is a military man. He led siege defense. Like, he was really involved in true warfare combat. So, should we look at these treatises and also try and adapt our um, practice to what their purpose was, you think? Or would that break up HEMA too much between trying to like recreate warfare, duels, and practice?
well, let's start by saying that the main difference between like the various manuals is, we talked already about society, etc., etc., which develop needs and develops practices which are related to social environments. For instance, Fiore, in my understanding, was like teaching the art of using weapons in in all the various contexts in which like a knight of men at arms, etc., etc., had to use the weapons. So it's like we, as this century people, we love specific stuff. But for instance, the Fiore book is far more unspecific than we may think. That's also why I like it, funny enough. Instead, other manuals seems to be more specific. So we need to, and the more you go forward in time, funny enough, the more they get specific in a certain environment,
Yeah,
and the social context, etc. Military saber is for
exactly.
military people, like,
Yeah.
and for so I will say that these maybe the thing that you just said is something relevant but complex, as you already
Mhm.
mentioned, and it is also it is complex at an imaginable level because there are even manuals which are so unspecific that you may say, then what is the context in which I should apply that stuff? And the answer is, oh, all the context that like 14th century men at arms will deal with.
Yeah.
So yeah, but on this side, if let's say that we had all the possible options, tools, etc., time, whatever, I would be on that part. So let's do the best thing possible in relation to this thing and that thing, etc. To an
Yeah.
extent, for instance, like on Fiore, the dagger of Fiore, for instance, if you do it like the classic knife self-defense, it honestly it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mm.
If at a sudden you create a situation in which someone has the weapon at the belt and they are extracting the weapon because they want to hit you with that weapon, and contextually speaking, it may be that someone is doing it on the road because you just insulted each other in a very harsh way, or because someone is a threat at a sudden and you want to deal with them before the other does with you, blah, 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 whatever situation, or you are fighting on a battlefield and you lose the main weapon, and so you take out the secondary or tertiary one, even, which is the dagger. So, in this condition, in which there is that time that you need to take the weapon out, if you put it into training, at a
Mhm.
sudden, it unlocks the realism behind all the actions. And
Mm.
by doing this, you say, so most probably not, which may not necessarily be true 100% of the time, but most probably the idea is that it is not something which is happening, obviously, out of the blue or in the void. It is something which has a context. And the context is that something is already happening, and then that thing happens because, and at a sudden the system takes sense even more. So context is crucial,
Yeah.
but not easy to spot.
Yeah, and what you're saying now reminds me a lot. And by the way, hi, Dequitem, thank you for joining. But it reminds me really of what we talked about last time with Dequitem. So the use that he does, the scenarios he builds where the fight is brought from the sword to the dagger to the grapple on the floor.
He does a
Um,
great job on this, by the way.
yeah, that's now that you were talking about this, immediately I kind of went back to what we were talking about in his videos because that's a lot of those techniques and those things make sense in that moment when you're one against a bunch of people, when you're on the floor with someone trying to stab you with a. Whereas I can imagine training them in a gym as self-standing drills may kind of feel a bit alien in a sense. Like it may not make a lot of sense. Um, so yeah, perfect time to join, Dequitem. Thank you. We have a question again by Left-handed HEMA with Lord Ramirez. So, as a fellow Montante practitioner, do you have any new thoughts on Montante sparring?
Okay, so let's say that I sometimes practice Montante with Niccolo Menozzi because he forces me to do. No, of course, because I enjoy it. We had sparring with Montante, and like you have to exercise a lot of control, uh, a lot of control in terms of really a lot of control. And sometimes, if you want to push a little bit too hard, it's even a problem for your joints, funny enough, because when you are, if you want to go fast and then stop a little the hit to not hurt each other, that's a problem. Like Niccolò lately developed, like asked for various tools to practice in a slightly more safe way. He has some reggae like spadoncini, I will call them. So not really Montante, but almost. They are very good on thrusting. They are ultra safe on cutting. It's always a huge leverage which hits you. But you can triangulate it with other tools such as like padded weapons and stuff like that. So sparring with Montante is more complex. You need far more tools than with any other HEMA weapon. But it's if you want, everything is possible. I am always of this idea. You have to just take care and be with someone which you trust, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And speaking now, different weapons, mentioning Montante. So you obviously have a time frame of preference. So we mentioned late medieval, early Renaissance, but within that time frame, do you enjoy all kinds of weapons, or then do you also have like your strict set of things that you practice with, and you don't move from that?
So I mainly practice longsword. So to an extent that at some point during certain parts of the year, I only practice longsword. But and I am pretty sure of it because it just happens. It's a weapon that it makes you very easy to get access to a lot of other weapons. Like I practice also a lot of even if it's not let's say dealt with in any manual, but I use a lot the arming sword alone, which is a very enjoyable weapon to fence with. That one I practice it regularly, generally speaking, if I can, once per week or once every 2 weeks. Longsword, I practice it an amount of hours which doesn't even make sense. Then when I have chance to meet other friends and other instructors which practice other weapons, such as Nick, for instance, I practice other weapons too. And I generally apply my knowledge, which I developed mainly, of course, by fencing with the longsword. In terms of how I approach Fiore, I also practice spear and dagger, mainly because of ideological motivations, which are the three knightly weapons which are true for the entirety of history of the knights, basically. And that weapons, like the dagger, I practice it, let's say, not so much, but I am trying to add it a little bit more lately. The spear is something that, like, if you know how to use the two-handed sword and you pick up a stick once in your life, you know to use a spear, then mastering it is completely different, because as anything which is ultra simple, mastering it is very hard. But I also practice it too, but to a lesser extent. Like, it happens that once a month I practice spear and stuff. But yeah.
Cool. Well, we have just a second. Let me catch up again on some comments here. So, hi, Glatrix, welcome. Better late than never. So, then we have a question. You were just mentioning Fiore now. So, Prosper Tipaldi again has a question about specific contexts in Fiore, like sitting on a bench or like these unusual scenarios.
That's actually what tells you that he's talking about so much variety of situations and conditions that you may say, so you are just showing me a guy which is defending himself on a bench with a stick, and why you are showing me this kind of thing? Because I have to train how to defend when I am. No, he basically just gives you the tools, and sometimes he gives you examples. And these examples are not only examples for techniques, but are also examples that are teaching you something, like symbols. Well, throughout the entirety of history, I would say, but especially in the Middle Ages and Renaissance times, symbols are really important, and teaching through symbols is important. Like that image tells you, that stuff that I am showing you, it's useful in a huge variety of situations, even when you are having dinner. Like, so yeah, and it's true, and it's extremely true that he shows very, very specific conditions sometimes, but it's also useful fun enough to understand that precisely that makes you understand that you use his fencing and his way of fighting actually in a variety of situations.
Okay, we have a question. I'll do a little moment of question time because we have a couple coming in. So we have one by Phil Simondi. Any plan to ever get into my personal favorite, the Rapier?
Okay, so back, I don't know, like 6 years ago, I fenced a little bit in terms of Spanish destreza rapier, and mainly, even if theoretically speaking, is not considered destreza, but it is Thibault, uh, which it's weird destreza, right? So, but yeah, I fenced a little bit with that weapon, but I didn't. I'm not into it actually at all. Basically, I had a friend which was into it, so I bought a rapier, and we did some drills, we did some sparring and stuff. I also participated with a terrible, terrible outcome in 2018 or 19 in a rapier tournament just because I bought it. And so there was that tournament. There was like a longsword rapier and something else. And I said, well, I have a rapier. Let's try out. I performed in a terrible way. So I'm not really a rapier guy, but let's say that maybe at some point I will approach it. It's not a weapon which I dislike for some motivation, simply that it's not in my area of interest for now.
Okay, I'll save a question on the Rapier issue, but I'll quickly move into a question here by Dequitem, which is, do you really think there's a certain level where you don't learn anymore from training with one weapon over a long time? And then he follows up with, because you mentioned that you train on longsword for unreasonable long amounts of time.
So, in my opinion, there is never a moment in which you stop learning. And actually, so in my understanding, especially because I train a lot with a single weapon, training works in a way in which you have plateau, which may endure for even 2-3 years. And it depends from the plateau and why it happened, because it may be a lack of experience at the beginning, lack of imagination, it may be lack of contact with other environments, people, etc., that may contaminate your way of thinking, etc. Or simply there is something that you got stuck into because you don't even believe it is possible, which is funny. But this is also, if you think that something isn't possible, you will never be able to do it anyway, even if it is possible to do it. So I experienced all these kind of things, and maybe even others, and at various times in my life and in my training. So I got stuck at various times. Then I had like maybe a huge growth, which then became a slow growth, and then another plateau. And so I'm still like, if you want to hear something funny, I actually had I got out of a plateau like 6 months ago, which was enduring since not too much, but like 1 year and a half, 1 year. And because of the last thing which I mentioned, it was like, okay, so this stuff doesn't make sense. Like certain actions, certain ways of approaching certain actions, etc. But like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to approach fighting in this way. And then I said, well, but maybe no. Then I watched other people which were doing something similar. I said, well, let's give it a try. And I approached it. And when you have to approach something, when you are into a plateau, you have to do something at which you suck. And that's the problem. So the only way in which you can deal with the plateau is that you already know that you have to deal with the plateau by doing things which you suck at. And if you know that the process is this one, is easy. Otherwise, it's easy to say, okay, so it's true that it doesn't work. You see, I tried out, it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. And you just confirm yourself. So dealing with, to answer the question is like, you never stop learning. There are only huge plateaus which are not so easy to deal with. That's it.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of also approaching things with an open mind. If you move out of sport and practice, I mean, I've experienced this also in other sports as well. So it's something you have to actively monitor yourself for, and then kind of be able to push through. But I also see it a lot in even just studies, and like my interest is more theoretical or practical in terms of handling antiques, but not so much fencing. And you often approach things with a mindset that is already, oh, I don't like this kind of sword, or oh, this sword makes no sense. And then it's okay, what? But it exists. So obviously, does it make more sense that you are right, or that like people that actually created a weapon and used it throughout history had a reason to do so? And then if you are a little bit humble in your approach and say, okay, maybe I need to kind of put aside my opinions and look at how things work, then suddenly, so you have these plateaus. Even I feel it's really a mental approach that I think can be applied to a lot of different things.
Yeah, like the problem rotates around the fact that you have to be like insightful. You have to try to analyze your own self in an introspective way, which is not so easy actually, and it's not even comfortable sometimes, because like you have to be ready to say, oh, okay, I was wrong. Shit.
And wasted a bunch of time. And yeah, true, for sure. So okay, we have a couple more questions, and then we'll move into a few of mine that are hanging. So well, one is then still going back to the Fiore point. When do we get a modern fencing book about Fiore? I assume written by you.
Like so we have to start by saying that like I am there, like my mind is very good at organizing things, but what is outside of the mind is terrible at organizing life. So I can think about very complex things and developing them, but when I have to organize work, like but I promise you that I will do it. My idea is to actually start it this summer. So ideally speaking, this summer I will start writing my book on Fiore.
Nice.
I don't know if it is true. That's the idea.
You have to start with a with a big goal. And actually, this matches a lot a previous comment that I forgot to mention by Prosper Tipaldi again. That is, hopefully we get more trained historians to look at HEMA sources. It feels like there's a whole continent waiting to be explored there. And I think even just by looking at it from the outside as a, let's say, academic student more, I feel like lots of times I listen to Guy Windsor's podcast, and like they could keep republishing editions of Fiore with commentary. It would just like, it feels like every interpretation opens up new doors to more things. So I feel like, yeah, like with many other fields, it's just a never ending, it's literally never ending in the sense that every person can probably bring different insights and
That's true.
contribute to conversations.
That's true. I will say that you can go at a level of in-depth that hard to measure, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
The limit is how much info you have
Mm-hmm.
and how much speculation you have to put into it to make it stable. Because we have to be honest, we speculate a lot. I
Mm-hmm.
always say, and not always, of course. Sometimes we have informations, but in HEMA we have to speculate to build up our things, our interpretation, our craft,
Yeah.
etc. And that's something I try to always be super honest with. I always say when I present some video about interpretation stuff, I always say that I have where I am especially to put speculation into it because if we stick if we only stick to the source itself, we will do something which doesn't necessarily always make sense because it is in the void, as we
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before. Also, the interpretation of a manual may be actually completely in the void if you are just too obsessed with words and execution in oh my god, 1-to-1 compared to what is word. So, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
speculation super important.
Yeah, and dangerous. Like you
Yeah.
need it, it's necessary, but also risky. Yeah. But yeah, especially with like as far as I've read through the treatises or like my experience, you need it because not everything is spelled out. You don't have a like tutorial, a YouTube tutorial. Well, you're making them, so luckily, but you didn't have them at least.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well, that's true. Actually, it's like that's the hard and complex part of the thing, and also what make it spicy. Let's say
mm,
that you can deal with the things in a speculative way, in a way which is not so like there are not so a lot of environment which have access to a condition in which you can both use let's call it a scientific approach, even if it is far from easy in HEMA because we have not a lot of sources which can be compared, etc. But you can, to an extent, depending from the research you do. For instance, like Nicola is doing
mm,
a good job in this sense. He's
mm,
acquiring more data, etc. But you can use that approach, which is useful and important, etc. But you have also that speculative part, which it's not speculation per se because it is not only based on okay, I had this idea. It is also based on the practice that you can make triangulating with tools, etc.
mm,
So it's speculation but has value into it, but from other aspects which are not obsessive scientific approach
yeah.
collecting data over and over. So it's a peculiar environment. That's why I really like being into it. It fits my brain, which is weird.
Nice. So I'm trying to catch up on the questions, but they just keep on coming. So we have another question from the Latrix. So I've seen a bit of cross training, I think on your channel, definitely. Do you feel that fencing against other systems, even outside of European systems, is good to help reinforce one's fencing?
So I would say yes, and I will say that if you have the chance, you should always fence and even practice and learn, if possible, the greatest majority of the thing you know, the thing you may meet,
Mm,
because there is value in like even the things that may not feel real, not every single time, of course, not unluckily, but sometimes people are just selling stuff which doesn't make sense. But when you are experienced enough, there are things which on paper, well, by looking at them, they may feel like stupid, but they simply are built up in a way which is related to a different way of practicing with limited tools, possibilities, and stuff. which developed some ways of practice, which then modified throughout the ages and the masters which approached it. And if you're, of course, this requires a little bit of knowledge, I would say, that if you're able to spot this kind of thing, especially, you may learn things which are unbelievable from something that on plain sight may seem stupid. So my advice for everyone which is really a lot into like sword fighting and martial arts in general is that do not consider only the stuff which works on the spot as the only interesting part of martial arts. Also, the tradition has a lot, but you have to understand how to read through the language, and that's the complex thing. But the more you get into this idea, and like also exercising with speculation in HEMA is useful to understand this kind of thing, funny enough. The more you learn about other martial arts, and you can even borrow what you learned and bring it in your craft. So 100%, like I am a huge fan of, I'm a weeb, of course, as among all the problems that I have, I am also weeb. And so I really enjoy Japanese swordsmanship, but also because it is more about psychology than practice.
Yeah.
And there are many books, especially the like 17th century books of Japanese swordsmanship, which are extremely interesting, and I learned a lot from them. So yeah, go for it.
And I mean, it stands to reason. Of course, now we're going into the speculation territory, but there was contact. And while you may not have huge influences between one system and the other, I would imagine that someone who is passionate about fencing or fighting, or a military person or fighting person, would definitely approach new techniques and new philosophies with a very open mind and not be like, oh, sorry, this isn't in my manual, so I don't care what you do in Japan. And so I think it's just a natural tendency too, when you are put into a different environment, to be like, oh, wow, how can I make this work with my own knowledge, or how can I compare it? And our next question actually moves even further in the extreme here, because do you think it makes sense in HEMA to cross-train with weapons that were not historically contemporary? So longsword versus saber, for example.
Okay, so I consider that thing fun. So it's one thing that you may do for fun. In terms of how useful it is, like it is useful as 21st century people, not in a, like it's not research. It's about your tactical understanding of the fight, developing your qualities as a swordsman, as a fighter, whatever, and fighting in conditions which are easier to deal with, harder to deal with, etc., which may be stressful sometimes, is extremely useful. So it's not something that needs or should or what you want to do in a great amount of time, but it's useful because it makes you think, and thinking is half of fighting, maybe even more.
Cool. And then we have a compliment for Niccolò and the Spadone project. So Mayor's Mate, I think you are definitely correct. So best thing out there. And we also have a comment by Hastings Historic Combat Association. So just started looking into HEMA, no club near, so lots of reading on YouTube, longsword and arming sword. But a lot of my start in learning has been your videos. So
cool.
So you're influencing budding HEMA and associations.
That was the goal from the very beginning. So
cool. Okay, so now that I think we were up to date with the comments, I have a few questions. So we talked about speculation and things, and also about keeping an open mind. So I think maybe approaching this question in that sense, not in the terms of being super rigid, but do you think there is an ideal beginner's weapon for HEMAist? And do you think there is a absolutely stay away from, like in terms of kind of objectively, although it's maybe a bit of a big word?
So let's say that, well, for instance, the longsword is a relatively complex weapon, but it's accessible. It's not so hard to access.
Mm-hmm.
Weapons like paired, well, not paired weapons, but sword and dagger, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
shoe swords, even stuff like that requires a lot more qualities. You need coordination other than tactics, techniques, fitness, blah blah. So that's maybe what I could point toward when I say maybe it's not a beginner weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Fencing with one-handed weapons in like saber is probably the most accessible weapon ever. If I had to say which one is the easiest weapon to fence with, I would probably say saber, in my opinion. And let's be honest, I'm not a big saber fencer, but I say it by perspective, by watching at the weapon and looking at how much time you need to be decent at it compared to others. And I would say beginner weapon, saber.
Okay. It's a pretty cool weapon, I
True.
think, to start with.
Everything which is easy to learn, hard to master.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Okay, cool. So recently you published a video about that you called Manifesto 2025. So it's kind of your insights, I think, on the coming year and on the future of HEMA. You talked about that quite a bit in the video. So if you haven't watched that, everyone, make sure to go watch it. But I was just curious about what your thoughts are on, yeah, if you want to kind of dive into a little bit what inspired you to make that video, why you felt the need for it.
Like I made that video because we are at a point in which I'm pretty sure that specifically from now on we see far more structure in HEMA, which it's not something bad actually. I really enjoy the fact that it's developing, but from now on it's even more important to think about the direction in which you are going to develop it. So that's why I decided to make it. About the content which is in the video, it's mainly related to what we have discussed basically till now, which is my perspective on the subject of how to deal with the practice and the study, and how, if possible, because that's crucial, if possible, they should be complementary. This is true especially for the instructor. And if we ever will have a way of creating structures which is developed and structured and blah blah, which may happen in the future, and we have to be ready for it. We have to consider dealing with it in the smartest way possible, which, in my opinion, should be maintaining the peculiarity of HEMA, which is relating it between, developing it in that spot which is between research and physical practice, which is not only the best way to develop the practice itself, but is a very good way to develop intelligent people, actually, in my opinion. So I see through it some sort of a mission, because I have a very kind of Greek idea of the human, and I sustain and I notice it on myself that physical practice makes you live a better life and makes you able to think in a better way, because you actually feel good in the very beginning. And this is true for on the opposite way. Being a very intelligent person makes you practice your physical activity in a better way. And so this of course goes even deeper, but just by looking at the surface, you see how complementary these things are. And this is true in every aspect of life. And HEMA is living this peculiar moment in which we are luckily still in a situation in which you are not developed too much in one direction or the other. I always push people to say, let's remain in the middle. Seems a very good idea.
What are the elements that make you think that we're kind of on the verge of this a shift in quality or
Okay,
in
so
pace, let's say.
I'm a very instinctive person.
Hmm.
So admittedly, I will say I am feeling that we are at a crucial moment. If I have to tell you why precisely, I can't tell you. It's just the observation of how much, like the how much people is approaching the clubs, how much people is approaching competitions, how
Hmm.
competitions are developing. The fact that, for instance, the first competitions are starting to give money as a prize, and sometimes even a relevant amount of money for a single
Yeah.
person, at least for me. Uh, and everything of the like the way in which approach manuals, how much people are approaching them, and at which degree, the research, all this kind of stuff. Everything is improving. Everything is getting more structured. Books are getting published.
Hmm.
Uh, Tools are getting made. There are factories which are making things for HEMA in a way which is extremely developed compared to
Yeah.
back then, which oh, you need a jacket? Let's start to sew this jacket, which
Yeah.
is unique. And everything is developing. When a system starts to run in this kind of complex way, and parts of it are interlinked,
Hmm.
we have to always think at a system in this way, and we have to also understand that this, of course, goes beyond the way in which a person may conceive even a complex system, but we have to be aware that being on a system which starts to run on its own, it's not always easy to steer in one direction.
Hmm.
So the intelligent person should do the smartest thing possible, which is you should direct the boat when you start to float out of the, you know, that's
Yeah.
that's that's the idea. Because then after it will become harder and harder. So that's why
Yeah.
I'm pushing for it right now.
Do you feel there's the risk of creating kind of a leviathan in a sense, like this monster that is uncontrollable? And
Well,
I'm thinking more in terms of bigger sports. You know, when you start them, you're mentioning prizes. So you start having sponsors, money, a bunch of different interests that are outside of the practice or study. And do you see these as potential dangers for the activity or as opportunities?
both. Like
Mm.
everything is an opportunity and a danger at the same time. Compromises are a problem and a solution at the same time, which is boring to say because it's always cool to approach the life in an ideological way or in a super pragmatic way and say, oh no, it's always good or no, it's always bad.
Mm.
And also falling in relativism, luckily, it's a problem too. But the reality is that money will help developing faster, exposure on the media will help
Mm.
developing faster, but what it brings with it, we all know. Like every system which develops a lot becomes a little leviathan, as you said, in a sense of like sports or whatever. Then
Yeah.
changing it becomes more complex and complex. Sometimes even impossible in some, well, impossible not, everything is possible, but close to impossible for some huge sports. But HEMA is far from being at that in that condition. But if like one thing, one problem that we have today as a society, in my opinion, is that we want to be the proof of things. But when you have one end, which is like it's extremely important, for certain things in life is extremely important to have the proof that something works, like
Hmm.
medicine, whatever. But when instead you are giving a look to some things and you try to predict a little the future, and you want to make something work for the future, you can't wait for the proof that something, like if you have the proof, it's already happened.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to like speculate a little on the future
Yeah.
and say, okay, so but watching at the systems around me, what happened in all the other systems that in the end are following more or less that development. It just happened, I don't know, 100 years ago or 50 or oh shit, the same thing is happening in all these kind of things. So it's not hard to imagine that it may be
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah, and I think like a recent example of this huge explosion would be like with MMA and all the different uh, federations or whatever they are. I'm not sure because I'm not a huge follower, but they went from underground to basically
Yeah,
massively mainstream within a
you're
handful of
right.
years. And what I've noticed that's interesting is the Buhurt attempts to make them, like you see them fight in the octagon as well. Like there's these, and they're weird until they're not weird anymore. Like one day, suddenly they're on TV and they're like pay-per-view and stuff. And then it's like, oh, well, where did this come out of? And
Yeah, like the perception of what is weird or not depends a lot from what is mainstream or not, and it depends from people which decides if that thing sells or not sometimes.
yeah.
So yeah, like people hitting each other in the octagon with bloods which goes everywhere. Uh, Everyone in their heart has a need for violence because we are human, and so that
Mhm.
things simply work. And the smart chap who thought about it the first time was well, actually a very smart chap, and so he went, okay, so let's make this thing like real, and let's make it huge.
Yeah.
It should not be so hard, and in fact, probably it wasn't.
Yeah. And actually, now that we're talking about it, another parallel I see is with the initial approach was like they had a lot of this mixed, it was true mixed martial arts in the sense that you had like a sumo fighter against the
That was
like
yeah. The
no, just
original idea was like the Gracie,
yes,
the Gracie brothers, which organized everything, and they actually
exactly.
organized everything to make to show off their system.
Yeah, and now suddenly it's a sport with federations. If you don't agree with one rule, you move into another kind of environment, and so it just kind of reminds me of what we're talking about now in terms of HEMA. And actually, going back to your previous the video we were talking about, we have a question again by Prosper Tipaldi. If you caught any criticism after the video from either one of the sides, or
Not really, I will say. Probably nothing.
Hmm,
No one contacted me to be harsh in my regards. I know that sometimes people are disagree with me, but I mean, who cares? I respect their point of view.
and as a follow-up to that, I have my question would be: do you feel like your middle position is generally the position of the majority of HEMA people, or do you think they tend to be on one or the other of the extremes? Like, do you feel very alone in the center?
So it's not so common, I would
Mm,
say, but it's mainly like there are among the persons like one another division that we can make right now is that there are people which are doing HEMA and thinking about HEMA, and there are people which are only doing HEMA,
mm,
which is different, you know. And back in the days, everyone was like doing HEMA and thinking about HEMA. Now there is more this kind of division because this is another aspect which make me think we are entering another age of HEMA.
yeah.
So there is also this division here. So um, the people which are thinking about HEMA are lesser compared to the greatest, the total amount of people practicing it. Among the people who think about HEMA, there are, I would say, I don't know, like maybe 30%. Like I would say that, and I'm not sure about it. Probably we are like 33%, like 33 which are more into, okay, so
Mhm.
let's do only historical stuff, and others which are like, we have to push on the sports side because the nerds, blah, blah. And other people are just in the middle and are trying to find the right path, which I suspect is simply there where they are.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to put more people in the center and say, like, let's try
Yeah.
to do both.
It's really interesting because as you're talking now, I'm kind of trying to monitor the comments, and there's a bit of a debate going on literally on these points. So I'll just highlight a couple because I don't think we can go through everything. But we have Witless Mystic, who's I personally greatly dislike the idea of creating a unified structure when it comes to the art of swordsmanship. Art is this beautiful tree which grows wild, and pruning is terrible for the art. And then we have Prosper Tipaldi. It's okay if some people aren't interested in the historical aspect at all, whilst others would like to keep the H in HEMA. Maybe at some point the community will be big enough to simply split. So even as we're talking in these few minutes, you already see how people have different approaches, and it's really cool to see that. That there's this
And they
interest.
are both right. I mean,
Mm-mm.
so yeah, I mean, like like my answer to answer both the comments, I would say that there are things which are beyond our control as a single people, always, luckily, and there are things which are moving in one direction, and it's not yet. Sometimes we are entering a little bit into the philosophy side, but I don't want to enter too deep into that. Sometimes I ask myself, there are things which are just happening and can only go in one direction, or we are actually able to steer the direction of the thing, in a sense that the pragmatism which rules our lives nowadays has been always true, not yes. I don't think so. I think I am a huge advocate for I think that our will can control the greatest majority of the thing if we want and decide for it. And so yeah, that's why. So in this regards, I was, of course, more certain people have more power because of money, exposure, whatever. But if we don't apply our will when we can, it's
Yeah,
it's not a good idea.
true. Then Prosper brings up again the issue of HEMA as being anarchic in an organizing sense, and you realize that's something he quite likes, or he or she, about it
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. Well, that's true, first of all, and like as always, this is the fun part and the problem of HEMA. Like theoretically speaking, HEMA is a very cool practice, as you can see. It could even be bigger.
Hmm.
It's developing slowly, and like I am a huge advocate of slow growth. I think that slow things which develop organically through time, and this is true for everything, are the things which last more. While
Hmm.
instead, when you know, when people try to do the big jump in whatever context they are, and they maybe invest even more than they actually have in terms of money, effort, whatever, you have to pay that thing at some point, and
Hmm.
you have to pay the stake for it.
Hmm.
Personally, I am not a huge fan of this idea. I am for progression, structure, in a sense of having roots and order, which is developed by itself, ideally, in a sense of the things are getting together in the best way possible through time, through organic development, and through the will of whoever is developing the thing. So that's how I prefer it. So yeah, I like to an extent that HEMA is anarchic. It has some
Hmm.
problem because of it, but for now is going very well.
Cool. And then we have one comment here by Phil Simondi. Yeah, he thinks that the elephant in the room about HEMA's chances of getting mainstream is the high barrier of entry. So just the cost of equipment will turn many people off.
True, true. Actually, it's what, fun enough, saved us from like it's a problem for sure because one may think, oh, it's an elitist kind of thing or whatever.
Hmm.
But and it maybe doesn't make everyone who would like to approach it enjoy it. At the same time, the opposite on the
Hmm.
opposite side of the spectrum, it saves us from maybe interests from the outside. Fine enough,
Yeah.
because
And
developing an environment which gets mainstream asks you to develop the possibility for the big crowd to access it very fast and easily, which
and
would also mean that you have to modify a lot the practice.
yeah. Do you think this high barrier of entry in terms of cost is structural in the sense that if I think about the material you need, it's not that there's any high tech, like you're not using rare earths or lithium or stuff, and even the swords themselves, if you can get to the economies of scale that are needed, it shouldn't be more expensive than the majority of other sports, I suppose.
Uh, well, I suspect that, well, besides the, well, it's hard to say. I think that for swords, for instance, we are at a point in which you are halfway between that point in which you can make so much stuff that the you can repay 1,000 times the tools that you are using to make the swords. Mm, and the process in which you're actually making every sword by itself, which requires a lot of efforts, etc., and makes the sword cost uh, uh, a huge amount of money. We are halfway, so of course, like whoever has a business which rotates in that environment has the goal to uh, making money also.
Mhm.
So I don't know how much certain things in the market are overpriced compared to what they could be. I
Mm.
honestly don't know. Maybe some things are, maybe some are not, but I suspect that we are in the middle there. So there is not the things which, like for instance, the swords which costs more. It's easy to see why they cost more
Yeah.
when you use them. They have either they are safer, either they are well made or whatever. So you actually see the difference. So I suspect there is not a lot of stuff which is too overpriced in HEMA. There are some things maybe, but not too much. Probably, I don't know. Probably is the fact that we are still in that middle ground between making a ton of stuff and just making a few. Uh,
Mm-mm.
so yeah.
Okay. So anyway, here are the comments. There's a whole conversation going on. So I'm trying to filter out the questions. If I miss any that you really wanted answered, please add them back at the bottom because yeah, I only have two eyes. So, but one question that I think was definitely interesting is this one. So, if both sides, I think we're still talking about, of course, the two aspects of the human world we're talking about are assumed importance to maintain. Would you suggest introducing either the historical approach or the sport approach to newcomers, or do you think I'll add? Can you stay in the middle even with newcomers?
I suspect that it is very easy to, well, it's not very easy, but it's possible, and that's what I am doing right now to create something which is kind of hybrid to an extent, which it's not so hybrid that it doesn't have the nature of one or the other things, but because our environment, as I was explaining before, is made of sub aspects, let's say, techniques, tactics, etc.
Mhm.
You can put together things which some things we were maybe even lacking to an extent in certain, like Fiore, for instance, doesn't have a huge amount of tactical advices. He has a huge amount of technical advices.
Mhm.
So you can put techniques of Fiore, modern tactics extremely useful to compete. Extremely
Yeah.
useful to compete. Technique also useful to compete, but you can make it as historical as you want. And if you teach it in the historical way, and then you have, as I have, like some students which are, oh, I like to compete a lot. you can say, well, first of all, what you have learned can already help you during competitions. If you find something that you lack or whatever, I can work with you specifically on that subject. And that's what I would like to see, honestly. But of course, it's my ideal.
Makes a lot of sense. So going on the anarchist aspect of HEMA and how it is probably changing and like all the things we've talked about now, do you think there's still room for some of those fringe practices like unarmored sparring or even sparring with sharps, for example, in the world? HEMA, of course, will never, it's not going to be part of HEMA, but in the world of general practitioners, or is this slowly going to become something like we look at the Mansour and say, whoa, those guys were a little weird?
So in my ideal view of the future of HEMA, what I think is that at first there will be a huge focus on weapons, because HEMA is mainly about weapons. But if the environment will grow enough, if we will start to walk this path, which tries to a syncretic approach, so tries to unite the things together, and has a single view which brings people forward together on the same path, most probably we will see other practices develop. Most probably it will be practices such as cutting, for instance, which we already see, which we will see most probably, and I would love to see actually, wrestling related to our medieval tradition, which has some peculiarities because of the environment also. So most probably we will see these kind of things in the future, but it will only be possible if HEMA will keep this, will have this kind of syncretic approach in which we unite the two aspects. This will be possible. Otherwise, like if it will become a very, very extremized kind of sport, far lesser. We may have the chance to see some, I can't see it right now, but we could even see a new style of grappling developing from there. But honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense in this context, because there are so much grappling practices so developed and so proficient that why having another, honestly, which is a standalone I'm talking about, of course.
Yeah.
While instead as a unicum together with HEMA and developing some kind of Koryu style, Japanese Koryu, which is like the unity of the practices to develop the fighter, not to develop the sword fighter only. If we go in that direction, it is possible. Also, on the other side of the spectrum, we could not see the practice develop. If we become only obsessed with books and stuff, it's like, oh, but I don't want to practice, please. I just want to read the book on my sofa, and that's not good too.
Yeah, true. And you mentioned you started with unarmored or unprotected, let's say, kind of training. So
Yes.
without all of the, how different was your mindset when risking serious bruises or even, let's say, serious injury versus the sport-like version we have today? And do you miss that, or do you think there's a place for it or not?
Okay, so let's start by saying that I don't know if anyone knows, but I almost lost an eye.
Oof.
Okay, so when I was practicing in my first years of practice, and basically the weapon got stuck on. If you touch here, you will feel that there is a little bone in the cavity between the nose and the tip of the sword got stuck here, and didn't go in. And my eye became full of blood during that the period, and it needed like 2 months to go away. And so that was my first approach with minimal. Well, it was not minimal gear sparring; it was sparring back then.
Yeah.
And but I was pushing towards like it was also my fault, of course. I was there, but also because I was trying to implement the sources, which had more thrusting also in a system of practice which wasn't meant to like in
Yeah.
the environment of reenactment, of course.
Yeah.
So we had the sparring, and I almost lost an eye. Then I discovered HEMA. Then I started practicing. I bought the first spec jackets which were on the market. I did it for a year and a half with the jacket on, and then I started approaching. You know Roland Valzecker, the
Yes.
imitator. Okay,
Yes.
so I consider him some kind of fencing father for me, because then when I needed some structure in my training, I approached his way of doing things. As for like for any father, you then arrive at a point in which like, oh no, you're wrong, father, and then I went away from that's it. So
Okay.
I went
Yeah.
away from his way of practicing thing in 2016, 17,
Yeah.
and I developed my own one. But he gave me a lot, and during that period, I practiced mainly with minimal gear. And so I got back to minimal gear at first with the mask on, and then even without. And I also fenced with sharps during that period, briefly. Of course, I didn't have a lot of occasions, only when I was in Germany training with Roland and the Imitator guys and their friends. And so I had all the occasion to experiment all these things, even like borderline kind of practices, like fencing with sharps. I consider, well, fencing with sharps is honestly something which I will not honestly advise to anyone. It's dangerous, and if you are able to do it with a person that is extremely proficient in doing it already, which is very hard to find, I honestly will say that if you do it once or twice, it's enough to learn what is really useful from it. And then you are just playing with fire. And that's my opinion, of course. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is far more to learn throughout the practice, but it's risky. And instead, minimal gear practice, interesting, useful, limiting a lot. So, yeah.
Okay, so you're more a fan of the modern direction. Let's say you're not nostalgic for the, let's say, the old days of.
Sometimes, like I still do sometimes minimal gear practice, and I want to be clear on this. Minimal gear practice is extremely fun. Okay, so because you can, it's easier to give to your fencing a structure which is coherent, and you decrease the amount of doubles by at the beginning, like I don't do a lot of doubles in my fencing with gear on after years and years and years of experience. But especially at the beginning, when you are without gear, you're caring for the person in front of you. And so you do less stupid stuff. But fighting is also made of stupid stuff because you are under stress. So minimal gear is cool, is fun, is useful to an extent, but it's limiting, and it's not completely fighting, it's partially fighting.
Okay. Okay, so we've passed the 2 hours, but if you're still available for 2 more questions I have, and perhaps if anyone else has some last questions, we'll try not to keep you all night, but 2 points, yeah. So one point that actually Delatrix had mentioned to me a few days ago, knowing that you were going to be talking, was about the scoring systems. For example, the fact that, as far as I understand, even flat hits count, even though, of course, in reality, So do you think, well, first of all, what is your opinion on the scoring system? And do you think this is going to be a big issue in the development of HEMA, like coming to a universal approach?
The scoring system like depending from which kind of scoring system, etc. Like I honestly don't like the idea of having your fencing based on the scoring system. That's when like that's actually when things go wrong. And if you are obsessed and you train only on the scoring system, that's when the things go really wrong. That's why it's useful, for instance, to have in an ideal world a variety of rule sets. So it is harder to specialize. So the problem of the rule set per se is the actual rule set. Actually, everyone is fencing already on a rule set, even when they are. We also have to remember this. Even when you're not fencing on a rule set, you are fencing on a rule set. Okay, so every environment, every society. But when you go, if you go like in Germany, they fence in a way they stop after 30 seconds after being hit. They land an after blow only after 30 seconds. Then if you go in Spain, it's different too. If you go in Italy, it's different too, and so on and so on. And even inside of these huge environments, you have the different SAL which are training in slightly different ways, which are slightly different flavors of the same huge meta flavor. So this thing means that we, as always in life, and as rationalizing beings, we basically create rules that which are unwritten. But the funny thing, and this is true in life and not only in HEMA, the rules which came by themselves are the best ones because are based on actual necessity and in the proper context in which they arise basically by themselves. And unluckily, they can't be related easily with competitions. When even if you put the same rule in competition, like, okay, so if one guy gets hit, the other has just a few moments to hit the other, and then the fight stops. Okay. Then the result is completely different because we are approaching it in a completely different mindset, that the goal is different, etc., etc. So it's important to, like, if it was for me, I would like almost force people to spar without a rule set at the club. Like, are you fencing on the rule set? Okay, go away. You're not being into this club. No, of course, not so much. But the problem is that if you start to optimize too much your fencing to win the competition, of course, it's better to win the competition. But the risk is that by developing forward, that like at some point there will be a better competition compared, like a better scoring system compared to all the others, and so more people will start to use it, and some more people will specialize over it, blah 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 blah, blah, and you can imagine the outcome of it easily.
Yeah. So on this matter, Julian is suggesting more life points, losing and scoring rather than collecting points. So going down to 0 rather than.
Yeah, that's I have seen sometimes this kind of thing happening, and it's an interesting experiment. As any rule set, as any artificial rule set brings with it possibilities to weird developments and stuff, but it's very interesting, and I like it. Notice that every single rule set is a part of the reality of fencing and fighting. So ideally speaking, and I believe this, every rule set is beautiful in its own way, but the problem is specialization in fighting. And that's what we have to avoid.
Yeah, cool. So my last question, and then there are two more quick ones, but was talking about like the developments of HEMA. You were saying, oh, maybe if we can kind of create this development and research, like the space for development and research, things can even grow. Do you think there is room in your mind for a lot of the still not studied forms of fencing. I'm thinking of the Spanish Navaja, for example, or like all these more unusual weapons, a lot of maybe regional weapons and things. Do you think this could be something that HEMA would have room for, or?
I think yes, like it will be always some kind of niche thing, but like the more we move forward, the more there is space for niche thing. Like it's like a metal. There is
Yes.
dwarf metal. Dwarf metal. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard it. I've heard of it. Yes.
You have to start hearing dwarf metal because it's.
Oh, maybe.
So
I know what to listen to.
That's the thing. It will more or less, if ideally we will go in a direction which makes sense, which may not necessarily be my one, but just one way which makes sense, which is crucial. I suspect we will see a more sub-genre of HEMA.
Cool. So one question here by Mayor's Mate was, will we ever see Fiore's crazy powder poleaxe?
Oh my God. I will, like, I'm up for all this stuff and I will test it on my skin, but oh my God.
Cool. And then I think one that is a good question probably to end the chat for tonight is, would you say that the DNA of HEMA as opposed to modern fencing is still pretending like we're fighting for real rather than sport?
Every single person which ever practiced weapon-based fighting in the entirety of history, which comprehends when they were actually using weapons for killing each other, was always pretending that they were fighting. And to an extent, even bare-handed fighters are actually fighting, but they are pretending to fight by a certain perspective. Because, like, I suggest you to watch, I really like Muay Thai. I practice kickboxing, and seldomly will practice some Muay Thai stuff into the club. Now, there was a fight between Buakaw and Senchai in which they fought barehanded. And they were fighting completely differently compared to when they were fighting with either the gloves and stuff on or the traditional gloves that they use in traditional Muay Thai. And like you see that already the thing becomes more complex. In fact, Senchai broke his own hand just by punching Buakaw in the face because they are trained over the other method far more than they prepared for the bare-handed one. This means that everyone on the planet, to an extent, when they are training, is pretending to fight. Pretending to fight is what makes you able to fight in the first place. And even modern fencers are pretending to fight, but they are developing some skills. Like if you give a small sword with a very narrow point to, like, I would never want to fence a modern épée or any other modern fencer with a sharp sword in hand. Because it would be risky.
Yeah, they're machines of speed and precision. It's insane. So, okay, that was thank you. So thank you so much for your time. It was a really, really interesting conversation. And thank you everyone for joining. And I'll see you in another episode. And I'm sure you already all follow Federico, but for those of you who may not, make sure to go check out his super amazing work. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.